Representative Tong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Brian. We've heard a lot of testimony today about polyamory, and I think alarmist suggestions that moving down the road towards gay marriage would lead us to polygamy and other abuses, for lack of a better word. Is that your position?
Well, I don't think necessarily I'm not making a slippery slope argument, I'm making a logical argument. I'm saying, why not?
So are you suggesting that a slippery slope argument is not a logical argument?
No, I'm saying that that could possibly happen, but the main reason to oppose this is because logically, if your whole definition of same-sex marriage is because people's emotion, love makes a family, and three people say they love each other, on what ground do you deny them their right?
But we draw lines all the time. As you yourself just said, there is no inevitability under the law. Didn't you say that just a few minutes ago?
I don't believe there's inevitability, but I also don't believe that 10 years ago or 15 years ago anyone would conceive of us having this discussion right now for same-sex marriage.
Okay. And if there's no inevitability, you also just said in your testimony that we set all sorts of limits all the time under the law on marriage. Isn't that right?
Yes, it's right, but I don't see why you would...
Children cannot marry one another.
But why would you set a limit that you yourself would agree is an abrogation of someone's civil rights?
I'm just asking you.
Yeah.
We set limits all the time.
We do.
Under the law. We set limits on things less momentous, like our drinking age, which is an important thing to do, but the drinking age, driving age, speed limits, things like that. We set arbitrary lines all the time, don't we?
Well, I don't know that they're arbitrary, but we do set lines.
But we set lines, and that's our job as legislators.
Yes, that's
right?
correct.
And, you know, we do them with more important issues, like, for example, consenting sexual relations. We don't allow children to enter into sexual relations with adults because we consider that to be statutory rape, and that is something that we don't want to allow in our society. So we could draw the line at same-sex marriage and not allow our society to go beyond that into polygamy or any other abuse you're afraid of.
You could do that, but I would ask you why. If you truly believe the arguments being made by Love Makes a Family, why? It's not a question of whether you can do it, but why would you arbitrarily say these people deserve rights and these don't?
Well, we don't allow, you know, as you said, cousins that are too close in relation to get married. We don't permit polygamy. We don't allow children to be married to adults. And I believe that we do that because we don't believe that those relationships are socially beneficial relationships. We don't believe that they produce a stable family unit, and we don't believe that they're well-grounded, both in social norms and our belief in our collective faith. We made a judgment in this legislature, though, last year that same-sex couples are entitled to the same rights as everybody else. So we've already made a judgment that same-sex relationships are fundamentally different than polygamous relationships, relationships between children, relationships between cousins. We've already made the judgment that under the law, it's okay for people of the same sex to be together in a harmonious relationship for life. Haven't we done that?
Well, again, same-sex couples could be in a harmonious relationship before you passed civil unions. What you did is you conferred certain benefits, rights, and privileges to civil unions. But to say that you allowed same-sex couples to be in harmonious relationships, no, that's not the case. I think they could have been in harmonious relationships before you passed civil unions.
I want to move on to this issue of civil rights because from the very beginning of today's hearing, we've heard some folks say that it would be better if we could dismiss the civil rights analogy and not talk about the race analogy, that it's not applicable and that it pollutes the discussion. And I'm having trouble with that. It seems to me that if global warming is the inconvenient truth, that's the inconvenient analogy. And let me read to you, and this answers a question previously posed about marriage as a civil right. I'm reading, and it says here, marriage is one of the, quote, basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. The 14th Amendment requires that the freedom of choice to marry not be restricted by invidious racial discriminations. Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not to marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state. The United States Supreme Court said that in Loving v. Virginia, a case that not too long before I was born would have prevented interracial marriage, and did. And I can tell you that I take my marriage very seriously. I've been married for 5 years this year. We have a daughter, she's 1 year old, and we were married in an Episcopal church in Stamford, Connecticut. But at the time of Loving v. Virginia, I could not have entered into that union because I married a white woman. And back then, it was unlawful because people thought that the mixture of men and women of different races would cause the decline and degeneration of our society. And that many of the Jim Crow laws and laws against laws promoting racism and a system of discrimination were there to prevent that very circumstance from happening, from men and women of different races from getting together. And today I ask you, we teach that now in our schools, and our children accept that that's okay for men and women of different races to be married. Has society broken down or died because of that?
Of course not. Loving versus Virginia was a great milestone in civil rights history. I support it wholeheartedly. Anti-miscegenation laws were made to keep the races apart. Marriage is to bring the genders together. You can't compare the two.
I'm sorry. Now, we heard earlier that to believe that same-sex marriage is right, we have to believe, conversely, that marriage is a discriminatory institution. Did you hear that testimony?
Yes.
So, by ruling the Virginia statute unconstitutional, and by deciding that people of different races could marry, did we thereby hold that the institution of marriage is discriminatory?
No.
Okay. Do you believe that we as legislators have a duty to ensure that the government in our society provides equal protection of the laws?
Of course.
You understand that we have a duty under our state constitution and under our federal constitution to safeguard that protection.
Yes.
Let me just ask you finally about another case. Are you familiar with the case Plessy versus Ferguson?
Yes.
What is the fundamental holding of that case?
Separate is not equal.
Separate but equal is inherently unequal.
No.
That is a mantra that not only do we learn in law school, but that we learn from our very earliest days in grade school in our civics lessons in this country. Isn't that right?
That is true.
And what's the status of Plessy versus Ferguson and the discarded idea that separate but equal is acceptable?
Separate is not equal, and that is another great decision that we made based upon race. But again, you're comparing race to marriage, and these are comparing apples to oranges. And again, this is what I said from the very beginning. To do this is to basically say, and this is what this discussion is about. We can disagree on these issues, but it's basically to say that that majority of Connecticut who believes that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are bigots. Because you just said separate is not equal, and you applied it to marriage, acting as if, because we have civil unions and marriage, we've created a separate but unequal status. By doing that, you're essentially saying that we are discriminating and that we are being bigoted.
I don't think I called you a bigot today, sir.
No, but
I'm just using our constitutional jurisprudence and logic to get to a certain point, which is how come we can't apply this jurisprudence and this logic? Look, somebody said earlier, and she was, I can't remember who she was with, but she testified, maybe the second or third person here, and she said that marriage between a man and a woman is fundamentally different than marriage between people of the same gender. Mm-hmm. And that you know, it's a very different institution. And so they are separate and they're inherently unequal. Isn't that true?
My whole testimony is to say that marriage cannot be what you're trying to make it into, that you're comparing apples to oranges, and that marriage is by definition the union of a man and a woman. To redefine marriage and to say that it is the same thing as race, excluding the races from marrying, it is the exact same thing to say that only people of opposite sex can marry. You don't need to say the word bigot. You're saying that it is discrimination. I do not believe it is discrimination. If I did, I wouldn't oppose it.
I'm sorry, I understand that you're trying to give me an answer, but I don't hear any answer from you other than you just can't apply the race analogy to this example, and you haven't given me an explanation as to why. Now, let me just close by saying that we've heard a lot of people dismiss the analogy, and we've heard a lot of people trivialize the civil rights argument. And I think that this is the issue, and it ought not be trivialized. This is the fundamental question before us as a civil rights issue, and that's what we're struggling with. And without an explanation or a complete answer to that question, it makes it very difficult for us to understand where you're coming from.
Well, I think Maggie did a great job of making this clear. As a group, as a class, opposite-sex couples can naturally give birth to children and rear them. Not all can. That's not what you say when you say a class. But in general, they can. And if they don't, if they decide to adopt, there will be a mother and father present. That cannot be said of same-sex couples. So just on the face of it, there is a distinction. There is a difference. They are not the exact same thing. And because they are not the exact same thing, it would be wrong to treat them equally. They are not the same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.